So you must all know by now that the current EU copyright directive, technically known as the Directive on Copyright in the Digital Single Market, passed during the week. Resoundingly, in fact. As you also might know, this isn't a finalised bill and there will be a chance to try and do something about it next year when it is to be passed into law in a finalised form, as an actual piece of legislation. There's a lot of people talking about this on the internet, so I want to avoid rehashing too much, but I think it's also important to some degree to multiply the number of voices in opposition to this. Article 11 and Article 13 are the particular points of the directive that are getting the most focus, and quite rightly so. I actually wrote an email to my MEPs. Maybe I did it a bit late, but I did get 2 replies, one from a Labour representative and one from a Conservative representative, and they were broadly similar and apologist. The Labour response was a canned one, and I was taken to the website of MEP Richard Corbett, where he stated his position on the directive. He supports the directive, of course, but shares the concerns about the overzealous nature of copyright restrictions, and has supported an exception for hyperlinking. I'm not sure how that will actually work in practice, and I'm frankly all out of trust on these issues. The response I got from a Conservative MEP, John Proctor, was this, and fairly representative of the Labour response. He also supports the directive, but shares your concerns, apparently. Yeah, right. The main point of apology here is that the bill is needed to protect, quote-unquote, a fair share of revenue. And if a platform's main purpose is not to share protected works, optimise them, or try to make a profit from them, it would not be required to conclude a licence. Many people accept the principle of these copyright provisions and have secondary problems to do with implementation. But I even have an issue with the principle of the thing. I accept that intellectual property should exist full stop, on a pragmatic level, purely to justify innovations, but I completely reject the idea that it should have the same levels of protection that other property has, and that is because I do not believe it to be a real form of property at all. Intellectual property, in its various forms, copyright, patents and so on, doesn't protect an instance of a thing from being plundered, it prevents somebody else from arranging their own property in a similar manner. When you download a file, for example, you are not taking an instance of the file away from someone, you are similarly arranging your own data in your own machine according to the instructions you're receiving from them. IP might mean that someone who comes up with an idea first is compensated for their effort, and this might indeed justify expensive research in, say, medicine and other fields, but there are limits to this. Very low limits. We are well into a paradigm where intellectual so-called property has already been abused over and over again. It can actually do the opposite of what it's intended to do and harm innovation when people simply hang on to a patent and prevent others from using it. And the sheer length of the terms IP lasts for is now well beyond the lifespan of any individual who would benefit. You can thank Disney for lobbying and lobbying and lobbying for copyright increases so that Mickey Mouse will belong to them until the sun puffs off its outer layers and becomes a white dwarf. IP has also been abused by big agricorps like Monsanto that copyright genetically modified seeds and wield this power to control smaller farmers. I'm very much in favour of the kind of capitalism that focuses on competition and real tangible properties, but I'm very much against the kind of capitalism that focuses on getting the government to control how others use their own property in the demand for arbitrary levels of profit, which ultimately is what IP is, even if you can think of a pragmatic reason to have at least some level of it in order to protect the proverbial starving artist, who more often today is a mega-corporate entity. So yes, I'm afraid I'm not even on the same page as the intentions of the directive. Shoddy copyright algorithms have already done enough damage on YouTube. Look, I want people to get their recognition for being first, but that's almost always recorded by society. What they're really after is maintaining their profits in the face of change. Dying industries gotta die. I'll be very happy when the entertainment and media industries wither on the vine and are replaced by entities that change with the technology instead of using force to resist it. And I don't care if it means those industries have less money and what they produce is on a less grand scale. That isn't an issue to me. But you try saying that in a political context, in a serious professional political context. You try saying that in the European Parliament. Try saying, fuck your copyright protections. even if you don't go to that level, we've seen how exceptions like transformative work or fair use aren't enough when really dumb algorithms start getting involved. And honestly, the algorithms seem dumber than the standard elsewhere, so I have certain conspiratorial suspicions, but I can't really prove anything on that front. I think overall that about covers the point of principle though. Then there's the matter of the exceptions that are supposed to be built into this bill to prevent it from being abused. One such exception says that if a site's purpose isn't to violate copyright, then it won't need a license. But I'm not sure this isn't entirely tautological. It's not like you could violate copyright and then say, hey, that wasn't my purpose, it was incidental. What about social media, which this directive is also being aimed at? The general purpose of Twitter isn't to share protected works. And yet this directive would supposedly apply to them. The abuse is writing the legislation in the first place, it seems. Internet culture is based around remixing and revamping and reacting and bringing new spins on things. There is no doubt that the internet we know and love is under assault with this latest measure, because it's already been under assault with all the previous measures. We've been living under this. I know that my MEP says that he's also concerned about users' rights and that adequate protections will be made, but why should I trust him? I've already experienced what the previous level of copyright protection looks like, and how much small creators get fucked over by it. Why should I trust that it should be different this time, under an even more expansive piece of legislation? The legislation containing safeguards is supposed to calm me down. The safeguard I want is for old media to accept that it's going to have to get slightly less revenue, okay? I'll give one thing to the games industry, which I often shit on. At least they generally consider things like Let's Plays to be free advertising. Generally speaking, people want to support creators, but they also want to try before they buy. And they don't want journalists telling them what's good and bad, for obvious, somewhat Gamergate related reasons. You're going to have to accept that most of the people pirating your shit weren't planning on paying money for it anyway. There's been studies on this. The EU even commissioned one, and it found exactly that. You can't talk about fair profits in a totally abstract way when you need to actually calculate how much revenue has been lost due to unauthorised copying, which is very hard to do. And when you try, it tends to come up as negligible, but links will be in the description. For a bit of worthless extra anecdote demonstrating this from my own life, I still to this day go to the cinema. I do this in spite of being able to, theoretically, nudge nudge, wink wink, get anything I want online. I do this because I believe I'm still paying for a valuable experience. That should be enough. It's not enough for the guys who want government to collect their lost profits for them. Incidentally, this is why I go back and forth on the social media regulation issue. I was in an episode of the Periphery podcast, and I expressed reluctance about trying to regulate social media to force it to apply free speech rules internally, and the precedent that would create for forcing other rulings on them. I mean, that would be great if they weren't constantly censoring things outside the mainstream, but a piece of legislation to enforce that only works, and well, it's only going to happen if you have a government that cares about free speech, and we don't. So in practice, I don't really want government to touch anything to do with the internet. I made a video more recently expressing a version of applying free speech rules to social media that I could actually accept, hypothetically. But I do go back and forth on this because it certainly does set a precedent, unless it's applied in the most narrow, pedantic way possible. If, say, people start to see the internet as involving public utilities in a totally generalisable way, then the government isn't just going to stop corporate oppression and that's the end of the story. It's going to use the precedent as a conduit for making corporations carry out its own oppressive plans. In this case, it's a third step up, because big corporations are using government to force other corporations to bully users. Maybe it's turtles all the way down. I don't want my MEPs to try and pacify me. I know that much. I know it's a con, they know it's a con. Let's get on the same page. I know that parties like UKIP did oppose this legislation, but it didn't do anything in the end. Not in that European context. And it doesn't work to vote third party in this country, when the best they can do is be a junior coalition partner, under the statistically least likely outcome. Taking aside the odd coalition, and some recent examples of that, which may create a bias which isn't very representative, the history of UK politics since at least the beginning of the 20th century, if not further back until the beginning of parliamentary politics, has been two-party dominance, even if which two parties were dominant has changed over a period of many, many decades. Certainly the next time any referendum comes up to change the vote from first past the post to an alternative vote, I'll be there. That's only the first step, but we need to change the voting system so that voting for somebody who isn't Labour or Conservative is truly viable. Right now they're in lockstep on the things that really count. I really mean that. You can laugh at me or scream at me, but the NHS and other issues actually aren't as important as this. Labour and the Conservatives vote for internet censorship, de facto through things like copyright or blatant and direct censorship. And they do this in Europe with this directive, so thank God we're leaving, even if we're making a shambles of the actual process. But then unfortunately they're pretty keen on doing the same thing here anyway, in the UK. As we've seen from recent actions like the online forums bill motion. Democracy isn't working for people who don't want to go along with this stuff. But unfortunately all we can do is spread the word and try and change the voting system itself. That's the level we're at here.